Welcome back. This is Daybreak, and thank you for staying with us. The hashtag is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. The conversation continues here on the broadcast. You will shortly be getting a story from Mashirima Kapombe, who was in Nigeria. And this story is on the impact of climate change and the continuity in climate patterns that are changing across the world, with the UN Climate Conference set to happen and the United Arab Emirates later this year, following the COP27 climate conference in the Egyptian city of Sharm el-Sheikh. Africa is amongst the continent that is vastly and severely affected by the consequences of climate change, yet the countries in the continent, including Kenya, Egypt, Zambia and Zimbabwe, are not the big polluters, with calls for mitigation efforts to address the hunger situation in the continent and around the world. Here is her report.
Citizens from various African nations called for the implementation of promises made to the continent on climate change adaptation as the inaugural conference on accelerating agricultural adaptation in Africa entered the second day. Tumal Orto from Marsabit in Kenya is one of them. He is one among many pastoralists who have adapted to changing weather patterns occasioned by climate change.
We are adapting through what we call time of plenty and the time of scarcity. We do what we call herd splitting, so that most of our animals do not give birth during the long period drought between May to October, preferably.
I think the fixing of the pasture is out of question. That's a priority. If the two can be fixed, then in a sustainable manner, it is quite possible indeed to maintain the lifestyle of the pastoralist. But the government must come in at a state where they are able to incentivize marketing options for livestock.
Although efforts to prevent losses during and after weather-related disasters have been put in place, Tumal feels those efforts for many are too little, too late.
It's not easy sometimes to offload because they are willing to do so, but the levels of awareness creation at the community level is not there, because most of these giant livestock keepers, they live away from the town centers, 50, 60, 70 kilometers. So the information sometimes do not reach them on time.
But financing facilities for both farmers and pastoralists remain a challenge, because many do not know funding exists, let alone how to access it.
Unfortunately, if you look across Africa, there is a gradual decline in the extension services on the African continent. So this is extension services, which would have been the perfect link to connect all of these ideas out there, all of these financing, billions of dollars we talk about, to the farmers that need them.
And even as deliberations continue, the need to improve awareness for farmers and pastoralists about adapting to climate change phenomena and funding cannot be understated, as recommendations need to reach the grassroots for action and lasting change. Mashirima Kapombe, Citizen TV, Abuja, Nigeria.
Mashirima Kapombe there in Abuja, Nigeria. Jacqueline Coyne, coming to you. I mean, when we talk about climate change by extension, here comes in the science. And the science of genetically modifying organisms, and that has been a debate here, intensely debated. Then is that an adventure, is that a venue that can address the situation of food insecurity in Kenya, in your view, before we talk about resilience and adaptation?
Let's begin from climate change and the effects it has had on food systems in Kenya. Kenya is largely a water-stressed country, and we have not been able so far to, make water available for farming. And so the coping would be to get drought-tolerant, say, seeds for farming communities. And therefore, my take would be, yes, go towards drought-tolerant seed, as Prof said, pest-resistant seed, and basically just early maturing, crops. And when we talk about genetic modification is a big debate. It is a touchy debate, and a lot of times it gets very emotional. Why does it get emotional? Because of the amount of conspiracy theories. And I remember that in the recent, in the past, Kenya banned genetically modified, crop, and the basis with which they used was from an article that was done in France, by a writer in a newspaper. This was later on subjected to a court process in France. And actually, the article was proved fraudulent, in France. And yet Kenya and India had used this, to ban GM modified. But I think we should work towards demystifying what genetic modification is. Look at, for example, grafted orange. All of us know that, and all farmers do that. Actually, most farmers now are able to, modify and they allow it to heal, and they say, I grafted this orange, I grafted this mango. That is actually modifying those genetics. Look at the Dorper sheep, for example. The Dorper sheep is an in-between a pig and a sheep, and it gives better returns to the farmers that do that. And including the drought-tolerant seed, the pest-resistant seed. And so one of those things that people should do is to demystify genetic modification and to realize that scientists, be they in universities, be they in research organizations. For example, in Kenya, KALRO has done a lot of research, in food systems, in livestock. Is to know that there are ethical practices in science, and all of us consume this. For example, if we get sick, we take medicine, we take vaccinations. All these are outputs of scientific processes. And so really, if this is safe to us, why do we think that in food systems it will not be safe?
Okay, Jacqueline, then, with that explanation, and in an attempt to demystify the entire concept about the genetic modification process, what are the consequences then? Because if I take medicine, for example, if I'm vaccinated against certain cause. It's a consequence. If I take medicine, as you have mentioned, it ends up to remedy my problem. What are the consequences here that the Kenyan public need to understand about the genetic modification of food, as you have explained?
If we consume the conspiracy theories and decide to use traditional seed, which is okay, so to say, but we have seen them not being drought tolerant, for example. We have witnessed numbers of animals die because of the vagaries of weather. We have seen seeds that will not mature, when rains are constrained. So the implication is that we will continue facing losses. We will continue having, poor farming communities. And this is actually the technology we are talking about. This is the precision that we are talking about. Adopting science in food systems is going to be a way of dealing with the current losses that we face every day.
Okay. Professor Bong, we have complexities here. Climate change on one hand, food security on the other hand, insecurity on the other hand. The pathway to food security, which is the ultimate goal that we have to obtain as a status. How do you balance both ends then? You have climate change that continues to affect people, and you have on the other end the debate about this entire question of the genetic modification of food. How do we balance all this and give the public clear understanding and the right messaging to all this?
Thank you. I think in trying to demystify, first of all, GMO, my colleague Professor Dwor will actually help you demystify it very well in the terms of what it is and what it is not. Because the public has got, as she says, a lot of theories. has got a different views depending on whom they hear from. So genetically modified organism broadly used, and then we come to foods, is where the genetic makeup has been modified. But you see issues like tissue culture, people still confuse them with genetic modification. So that demystification still need to go deeper, maybe from where we have been discussing now to remember my connotation to the ground, where things are always different. That's what we are told. Yeah. Now, when you look at climate change and there are what we call triple planetary crisis defined by UN, and that is climate change, there is pollution, and then there is biodiversity loss. And if you look at the three, they are really interlinked. All right? Let me say again that GM foods is not, or GM or genetic modification is not a system of production. It is a technology among many other technologies. So what we should be able to indicate is that we are not saying this is the only technology. I think that should be very clear. It is not the only technology. There are many other technologies. And if you heard we talk about value chain and Prof tried to say what it really is, you may plant the GM food or crop, but if you don't take care of it, you have not weeded, you have not added in what other things you need to do, it will still probably fail you. So in trying to use technology, knowledge is very key, but knowledge applied properly then becomes wisdom. So that bridging. So you have asked that there is climate change, and then there is which continues to make things worse, and which affects food security. How do we bridge it? First of all, we need to understand the climate change itself, because it is a long-term shift in temperature, and of course, not only temperature, but any shift in long-term in terms of changes in the ecosystem. So once you know that the ecosystem is changing, we then need to consume the data on this change and what we are calling projection. How will it change over time? And then we need to bring our acts in order. So if the climate is shifting and we are getting more warmer as a globe, then we need to understand which type of crops or animal will thrive better. And with that information, we begin to prepare ourselves. And this requires, as I said, a deliberate effort, deliberate investment. Without investment, and especially from ourselves, from ourselves, and in ourselves here, we normally take it to the government. Then without that deliberate investment, one in the technology and science, getting the data, and then using the projections and begin to invest in this technology that will get out of the whole quagmire. Otherwise, we will never run away from it, and we will never walk out from it. And if we wait for anybody to come from outside, sorry, it won't happen.
Okay, but Prof, besides the data, besides the process that you intellectuals in most times preside over, because you provide the expert analysis and the expert opinion on the same, still a component that must accompany this is the quality of governance. That's very key, isn't it?
Very key.
Okay. Professor Richard Oduor, coming to you. I mean, you have constantly explained the genetic modification process. But besides the explanation, which was tailored towards, addressing the public fears many had held, and deeply so, may I say, can genetic modification be the next frontier to address our food insecurity status?
Ayub, thank you for this. And anytime we talk about GMO, let me start by saying I make GMO. I have a training in genetic engineering. And GMO and development of transgenics, how we call it, is my entire life. And I'm also privileged that I spent time in Pfizer after PhD for postdoc, worked for them, making drugs. So I usually sit at a very privileged platform to understand the risks and the safety bit and also the food security aspect of things. Yes, genetic engineering is a tool. It is not the entire value chain, and it only addresses the traits or the challenges that are targeted. And what I think we should do now, because I look at GMO and I see how twisted the debate is, and I get to know that it's indeed the conspiracy theories that Jackie talked about is actually what has happened with the GMO. And this is not new. And I want to unpack something that many people will not get to know, and it is right that I do it. And lately, it is the line that I'm picking, that countries and people should understand that there is interest in every technology that is generated. And if we look at it as African continental, then we must understand as Africans what are the technologies that are good for us, and we must know that technologies are transient, meaning they just survive over time. If you don't adopt a technology on time, you lose out on it. And allow me then to take you through that history so that you understand that GMO and resistance for it in Africa is actually a design that we don't benefit from it. Before, remember the West used coal, C-O-A-L, to industrialize. That is how the energy was being generated for electricity and all that. When the rest of the world and Africa was actively getting involved in making, coal plants and all that, what was done again by the powers at be that time, it was designed, and a caveat came in, and it was indicated as dirty energy. That is, right now, we have a lot of coal in this country and in Kitui that we can use. We have a problem with electricity in this country. But do you know we can't use that resource? So who is paying us as Africans and as Kenyans for losing out on the use of coal to generate energy? Let's keep that aside. Go to the Green Revolution, and many of us understand this. Green Revolution talked about only two things. It is about, high yield and mechanization. So fertilizers, use tractors and everything else. So Mexico developed, Bolog was the first person actually to bring this, and it really saved the rest of the world. Asia developed, India, and all that. But now, do you know when, right now is when we actually getting to the Green Revolution, because that's when we are talking about fertilizer and, and we are talking about mechanization and tractors and everything. Do you know there is again another caveat? It is called carbon credit. Now, before you export your your cabbages and whatever, you're asked how much of carbon credit have you emitted? And yet this wasn't a discussion at that time. Now that we have lost out on that again, GMO has saved the world, but in Africa it hasn't. Do you know, Ayub, we are talking about GMO that was first commercialized in 1994. We are talking about a technology that is 29 years old. And most technologies survive between 25 to 30 to 40. Very few of them, go past that. So, and it is true, if you look at GMO also, we are now moving to something else we are calling genome editing. And soon you will hear that these conventional crops that have genes from other sources are not very good. We need to go for genome editing. And therefore, from where I sit, this is a narrative. It cannot be true. Ayub, ask yourself that we Africans are really so susceptible to GMO, while for 29 years it has been eaten in America, it is in South America, it is in Brazil, it is in China, which contributes the bigger chunk of population, it is in Australia, and in Africa we are talking right now about 8 countries. But we are still discussing here. So what has happened is that the West and the developed world have actually understood our behavior and our attitude, and they know that we are very cautious. They have taken advantage of that, and therefore we have been talking about GMO. And just before I conclude, because there will be time now to demystify this GMO so that people understand, and I hope I'll get an opportunity, Ayub, to unpack what is GMO, how do we make it, what is this risk, because when you are eating githeri, Ayub, you are mixing the DNA of beans and maize, because you never remove, when you are eating beef, you never remove the DNA, it is in there, and you don't wake up the following day with horns. So ask yourself what happened with the DNA. So I will unpack for the public to understand that it has never been about GMO. DNA is never toxic. It cannot be.
And what are the consequences? Because you said there are advantages and disadvantages. I mean, just also address the fears that you have. For example, on the flip end, what are the then disadvantages? Because you said the advantages are accompanied by the disadvantages.
Listen, and this is the truth. All the technologies must be regulated. And regulation is not new, and we cannot start talking about regulation and talk about it adversely when it comes to GMO. That is why, for instance, we know very well, Ayub, that the vehicles we bring in this country are 8 years old from Japan. They have done 8 years, but when they come here, we brand them with new number plates and we call them new, and we feel very comfortable. But we have accidents that are actually killing people in this country more than probably many crazy diseases. Why do we still have vehicles on the road and we are having accidents every single day? Because of regulation. When you bring your car, take it to NTSA for inspection, and you must insure it. That is what is called regulation. The same thing is happening in all technologies, including GMO. Okay. In this country, we have National Biosafety Authority that controls anything that is GMO in terms of importation, in the lab, in the field, and even labeling. Do you know in this country, and I hear people say that, you know, GMO must be labeled. Why are we not seeing them labeled and all that? And I laugh at them because I'm telling them, you have not seen GMO in this country labeled because since 2012 up to now, there has not been a ban. And therefore, there has been nothing on the shelves to label. Now that when we lift it, you will see everything that is GMO labeled. And so there are a lot, and I get a little carried away when I talk about GMO because it's a basic technology that can really help us.
Thank you. Yeah, Lucy, coming to you then, let's talk about wastage, because even before the debate comes down to the genetic modification process, there are instances where we can seal the wastage loopholes. For instance, as I have mentioned, the UN estimates that 13% of food produced globally is wasted between harvesting period and the retail, or between the farm and the fork that is when the food ends up on your plate. And another 17%, according to the UN, is wasted in households. I mean, how can these percentages be turned into numbers that can address our food insecurity status even before we go to the technology bit, as Prof has mentioned, to couple it up and patch things up in order to attain the status that we want?
Okay, thanks a lot, Ayub. I think I'll want to use very practical illustrations. Go to, for example, Wakulima market in town and look at how many oranges are rotten and thrown. Look at how many batches of sukuma wiki are thrown. Look at how many tomatoes are rotten and thrown. And just imagine a situation where across the different markets in the country, we preserved all that and consumed it at household level. I think that is a question I leave to us to answer. And again, at our households, to what extent are you consuming what you put into your plate? And suppose the 3 spoons that you throw away, and maybe you are 7 household members, and each of you is wasting 3 tablespoons of food, for example. Suppose that was saved and consumed by another person. So to say that it's very quick wins here, us looking at what areas or what parts of the value chain do we need to tackle food waste, and making sure that beyond just applying technology, because that's part of it across the value chain, looking at how we are managing, from planting, harvesting, storage, and all that, but also to what we do in terms of after harvesting our food, how we store our food, making sure that we can conserve and prevent wastage, from the storage, And I know, for example, the technology bit of it has been applied to some extent, but I believe there's still a gap. We can still do better than we are doing in making sure that we apply technology in improving on the shelf life of our foodstuff on the stores. But again, also looking at household level, how can we avoid wastage? And I believe that is easily doable. I can make a decision that I'm not going to serve more food than I need onto my plate. And that way then, whatever remains can be used at another time, or can be shared with another household. And can we then also think about to what extent do we need to also become very conscious in terms of what amount of food are we consuming entirely without having to do a lot more food and, having the same food go to the dustbin, as waste. So it's looking at the different stages of our food, the food chain and the food systems, and making sure that we can, of course, put measures in place that tackle the wastage. At times we think it's too minimal and insignificant, but I believe the scalability of it makes a difference and, of course, can impact on our food security as a country. And
Prof. George Abong, let's talk about what we have, because we are more focused on capital-intensive system of production and here in the country. more or less the disadvantages are very clear and the concerns have been raised. This largely gets the farmer trapped in debt, and the farmer therefore sells everything they grow because of the market problems, as earlier mentioned, to pay back the debts for seeds again, to plant again. That perpetual continuity still, and the debt and the creation of poverty, the mechanisms that still exist. At what point do you think this can be a past? Is the deployment of technology an address to this problem that we are facing, to address the capital-intensive nature of our production system?
Oh, well, allow me to, because she touched on my real
area.
My real area.
Okay.
Let me touch on it a bit, then I come to this. When we talk about food loss, food waste, you know, we talk about food is lost when we are not able to ensure that what we harvest actually reaches the consumer. And that is largely because of infrastructural development. So you are talking about the good roads, you are talking about cold storage, and so on. And that is what is more prevalent in our situation compared to developed nations, where the loss is minimized because the infrastructure is developed, but the waste now becomes a bigger issue in developed countries. But for us, we have more of the loss and a bit of the waste now coming in because of a number of reasons. And you would just look at it when you go to a buffet. Yeah. You will find somebody putting like this.
Mountainous.
A mountain, but they eat a part of it because they can't finish it. So that is actually part of the loss we are talking about. So to address that, you need to look at the infrastructure, and that requires some level of investment in itself. Coming to the question, it requires investment, and this investment, I say, must be intentional, not only from individual, but you see the government is a facilitator in everything. And then there is the issue of, so there is infrastructural investment, then there is the attitude change, and of course you are looking at what do we do with what is already produced. Then you have to work upwards and look at if we can't consume, can we repurpose it? Repurposing means, can you change it to a different form that can last longer? So that's where I come in as a food scientist. Yeah. Then we transform into different things that can stay longer. But again, it goes back to your attitude. Are we ready to eat dried vegetables, for example? So that if I have a lot of vegetables in Western, we dry them and we ship them where people cannot grow vegetables. So those are shifts that we need to talk about. And I was telling my colleague, we need to work much closer to reach that gap, because I may have the best technology, but if I do not know how to use it to reach the masses, then there is a problem. So then coming back to your question, you say that capital-intensive production, and which, of course, you had my colleague talk about, people have already moved some miles out of it, but we are now talking much about it. Capital, by the way, when you talk about food security, you are looking at about 4 pillars. Right? You're looking at access, stability, you are looking at, of course, utilization and availability. But in all this, you are looking at food which is sufficient, safe, and nutritious. Let's not forget that those are the mix that must come into food security. Now, until our people are able to have this enough or sufficient, which is safe, and nutritious, we may not talk about food security, in my view. So for us to talk about that, and we come to how do we produce, most of our farmers are small scale. Let's ask ourselves, because the basic thing we need to ensure is this small scale is able to feed the family throughout the year. Are they able to do that? The first question. So before this small family can be able to feed themselves, you cannot talk about a capital-intensive production, right? There are countries that I know that have really worked on this small scale. You look about South Korea. If you look at the system of production, They are basically very small, but because of the organization, they have been organized into groups and then into cooperatives. And then this fits into the bigger system. So there's the governance issue in this. So then that will sort out the small scale. So the capital intensive, if we want to feed more than the household, and of course the world, then we need to look at this capital intensive, and that capital intensive may not be simply be done by a small scale person. There must be a bigger system that is organized to do it, in my view.
Okay. Jacqueline, agriculture is an important facet in poverty reduction, because a food secure population means then a productive nation in all. We have talked about the patching aspect of, on one end, boosting our agricultural productivity, deploying technology, as the Prof has explained with regards to GMO, will be coming more about how it can help. But in terms of science, and you being the ambassador, resilience ambassador for the Alliance of Science, what then do you take from what Professor Abong has explained in terms of addressing first the wastage part, and then second, addressing the infrastructure question, because all these will in the end inform what ends up on the plate and how households across the country can be food secure status. I mean, talk to me about that and the place of science in all these.
Thank you. I have interacted with the FAO food waste report, and actually, globally, the loss is at 13%. But in Kenya, food wastage is at 40%. You know, that's close to half of all the food that we produce just go to waste. And it begins from the farm gates, you know, to the plate. And my colleagues have talked about it sufficiently. But one of the things that happened in Kenya, and from my experience as a former county executive committee member in charge of food security in one of the counties in Kenya, is that the onset of the new governance system of devolution posed a challenge to extension services. And there's something that keeps causing food wastage in Kenya: lack of market information systems. You know, sometimes in certain counties in Kenya, they have overproduced maize. And yet in other counties in Kenya, there are people dying because of lack of the same commodity. And so market information systems, you know, have to be resolved using technology. Number two, e-commerce, you know, investors should come into this space. And I remember my colleague from the Kenya Red Cross was talking about youth not being fully involved in agriculture. And yet, the statistics are that almost 100% of Kenya, you know, have access to the internet. Why are we not using this internet, you know, to move commodities and to move services? You know, that should be the next frontier.
But are all farmers then connected? That's another question. Looking at one of the government's key pledges, I mean, the hotspot areas across the country, though in marketplaces, sounds ambitious.
Yes.
But with regards to, I mean, the connection of the internet accessibility, are all farmers connected? What percentage do you think we need? Because this is a key stakeholder.
My point is that the youth can step into this space, you know, and move the goods from the farm gates to the markets. In more developed countries, if you go to the US now, to a restaurant, and you ate your food and you did not finish it, there's always this, you know, item of packing your food, and you walk out with your food. In Kenya, I think it's cool in Kenya not to carry away food, and, you know, a bit of wastage is a bit of, you know, being flossy.
Okay.
And I think this could be part of the culture that is creating food waste. I wish that all this food in buffets that we are wasting, we packed it up and took it to the street families. Why are we wasting it? Why are we, you know, scrapping it to the garbage bins? And so culture is one thing, and then we are talking about availability of cold storage, from the farm gates to the farming communities, even to the households. Because I know that most Kenyans buy at bulk because of the nature of trade of market days. So people visit market days and buy what is available in the markets because it's usually fresher. If cold storage is within households and is within the farming communities, if the farming communities are organized into cooperative societies and cold storages are available, then that will reduce it. Value addition, as Prof has talked about it, is the other front. But also, we struggle, and yet there were traditional methods of preservation. Okay. Look at, for example, vegetables, and he has already mentioned, traditionally, or sun-dried vegetables, for example. Have we in Kenya accepted to eat dried vegetables, or do we all want to go and collect, the fresh vegetables from the markets? Because if we can shift and say that dried vegetables are okay, for example, dried tomatoes are okay, then we will get less wasted. And so it is both technology and also culture. Okay, thank you.
We'll talk about the county aggregation centers that the government has embarked on, which is meant to value add at the county level. The case of Nyandarua, which was food surplus, yet other counties were severely affected by drought. I mean, the capacity of export, for example, within the country itself, because the case of Nyandarua was a very good example during the drought period. Prof, I want you to finish up on the question of the genetic modification process that you are partly remaining with. Then once we are done, I'll be able to pick up on the point of the county aggregation centers and how we can value add the food that we are producing at the moment. Please proceed.
Thank you. I think we need to understand what is a GMO and how is it done. Okay. There is nothing very new about GMO apart from just realizing that anything that is alive has in its central of the cells has DNA. This is like the motherboard. And what it means is that the technology that we currently have is that the DNA can be sequenced so that you get to know what is available, what section of this DNA is responsible for what. For instance, you'll realize other people are, susceptible to certain diseases, others are not. It could be because of genetic, variations. But more importantly, what we do as genetic engineers, we look at, for instance, if there is maize, we know maize cannot grow in a droughty environment. Okay. But when you go to a desert environment or in the desert, you will find that there are other plants that are growing there. You will find sisal, for instance, or cactus and all that. They are growing. And how we wish as genetic engineers that when maize is not growing and there is cactus or sisal, human beings will start eating sisal. Because if that was possible and it's easy, then we don't have a problem. Because let me tell you something that is very obvious, that at any given time in this world, there is usually enough food somewhere. If we are able, the world produces enough. Okay. And the problem is something else about distribution, and there are more experts here who can talk about that. What we then do as genetic engineers, we identify, yes, now there is a grass, for instance, that grows in a drought environment, and it does so well because it can survive that. So what do we do as genetic engineers? Grass is already being eaten by cows anyway, so it's not toxic. So the DNA that is in there is not toxic, and if so, our cows will all die. So you identify the section of the DNA that is responsible for drought tolerance. That is what you move to maize. Both of them are monocots, and therefore maize becomes drought tolerant. It could just be root elongation, it could be thicker leaves, or more other traits that we have. But before I conclude, there are a few things that we need to say, because they are it will help us with the demystification. Okay. You will hear this statement that GMOs seeds don't germinate, and therefore we are going to be reliant to, depending on these multinationals. They will tell you that GMOs cause infertility and impotence, very serious things. Okay. The GMO causes cancer, GMO is foreign.
Breast development.
And I can tell you, Ayub, and I'm glad that you are saying that, if it is true that GMOs cause breast development, we will not afford it as a country. the kind of investment that our ladies go through to develop their breast and make them farm and all these things is so you cannot afford. And I can tell you, if GMOs really cause infertility and impotence, then you will not afford it as well. Because what will we do? We will package it and sell it as drugs. Because contraceptives, we are here, many men who have had enough of their kids and they don't want any more kids. You only need to eat GMO and it stops you from having kids that you don't want. So we must be very careful when we talk about some of these things. GMO seeds, I want to say, germinate. Okay. And sometimes I think we actually, as a country, enjoy a lot more of rumor. Probably the reason why, comedy and some of these, crazy, tabloids are really becoming popular. Yeah. For instance, if they are saying that GMO seeds don't germinate, and I can tell you in this country, at Kenyatta University, we are the only universities in Central Africa that make GMO here locally. And in this country, we have 4 other labs. We have Kelro, we have Kefi, we have ICIPE, and also in Il-Rebecca and Kenyatta University. Those are the only 4 labs. Now, why can't the media, and this is a challenge, come to Kenyatta University, we give you GMO seeds. Let them bring the organic one, plant them, monitor, see whether they germinate or not. Because they do germinate, it is a fallacy. And if they say something about that, who, and this is also another one, that who is funding GMO research and all that. And I ask them, even right now, our president recently was just in China, trying to negotiate with that country and how do we get development here. So when did it become really this chaotic that if you get funding from Bill and Melinda Gates, now we become it's all fallacy. Okay, thank you.
And the question of multinationals, I mean, this is an avenue in the media, and as professionals we bear that responsibility to hear from the experts and those who have expertise, so that they can shed light and demystify some of the clouds that hang over the entire process. Let's now finalize with this aspect. Coming to you first, Lucy Sembei. And the government has embarked on a very ambitious exercise of the county aggregation centers meant to value add food that is produced at the county level. And ideally, that's why we have had devolution, devolve power and resource from the center, so that people can be empowered from the bottom up until the top. Then talk to me about whether this can address the very glaring question that comes up, because the world uses $150 million to import food, Kenya included, and we import a lot. Can that address our problem?
Thanks, Ayub. I think yes, to some extent, because ideally we are also really supporting farmers to come together and corporately invest in agriculture, but not just agriculture, but also into the value chains. For example, if you're transporting your goods and you transport on your own, and the other farmer transports on their own, then there will be double cost. But if these farmers come together and they pay the transportation cost corporately, then that cuts down on the costs they incur. So with the aggregation centers, yes, that would make a difference, and ideally, because it will reduce on the time spent moving our goods. And I think that is one of the factors that come into play when we think about food losses. And so for as long as the farmer doesn't have to do so much of traveling to avail their goods to the consumers they're targeting, then that already is a way to cut cost. But again, to also reduce on the wastage that comes with the transportation. But again, for me, it's to also look at to what extent can we also go deeper down and way beyond the counties. Because, for example, some of the county headquarters are not near to the community members. Some are many kilometers away from the county headquarters. So how are we also looking at being able to avail those services to community members that are at that level, and making sure that they do not have to transport goods for 100 kilometers, for example. So making sure that, yes, we do the aggregation centers, but also bringing the services closer to the customers to make sure that, to the community members, to make sure that they are able to minimize on the transportation cost and the opportunity to, of course, reduce on the losses that come with transportation. Okay.
Jacqueline, do you think, as a former, of course, a county executive member on food, do you think these aggregation centers will add value as they are meant to add value? Do you think they can be of value in our food systems? And can this address some of the glaring gaps that we have talked about here when it comes to the food security status that we want to achieve as a country?
My response is yes. But I will also show you how that may not work. What I have seen is that we have hardware being established, and the county aggregation centers and the whole concept is a brilliant idea by government. And if this can be implemented to the letter, yes, then it is going to solve the issues that we have just raised of food wastage. But then government does not trade, and this is really trade. It is serious trade. One, it is putting farmers into cooperative societies. Of course, the farmer cooperative societies are trading entities because the intention is to help the farmers to make profits from their produce. But also create aggregation centers in certain satellite areas, which I think is also a bright idea. But at the point of completion, at the point of value addition, and at the point of marketing, then government should now bring in the private sector. And if that happens, then yes, the answer will be it will add value.
Okay, Professor Abong, I'll come to you. Let's first take the feedback here of the Kenyan people who are watching this broadcast at Citizen TV Kenya. The hashtag is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422, and here is what you're saying on X, formerly Twitter. Godi Barasawere says better agricultural policies will guarantee our food security. This should be a priority for the Kenya Kwanza administration. Bobo Tiano says Kenyans should embrace consuming food from other communities to help cushion on food security quest. Like my community, Luos adopting to Githeri and Kikuyus to fish and accepting GMO because we have consumed them already in our markets. Rev Harrison _453 says, as far as GMO is concerned, I do urge the national government to make a plan to team up with counties to have many more farmers registered for subsidies in every county depending on the crops they grow. This will enhance food security. Baba Michelle K says it is sad that most governments are unable to fix farmers' issues to increase food production and promote food security and are now turning to easy ways of importation of GMO, which aren't that safe to make Kenya food secure. Shortcuts. Okelo Mwalimu says one of the major factors fueling food insecurity is the near-incessant tendency by young and the able-bodied citizens of abandoning rural areas with high agricultural potential to settle in urban areas for flimsy reasons. This has denied rural areas the much-needed labor force. Professor Bong, that last comment, is this a concern of a generation that is not entirely focused on agriculture with an aging farmers' population?
Well, from where I sit at the university, I was just telling my colleagues that the last 2 years in the University of Nairobi, Faculty of Agriculture, have witnessed a change. Earlier on, students were not choosing agriculture. But this year and last year, we have had at least 180 choosing it as their choice. That is a shift from where it was. So whereas we could be stuck with where things were, something is happening on the ground, and we may be able to see a shift as we go along. So that's what I can say in that. Yeah.
Okay, I see last comment. Professor, coming to you, Oduor, there was a comment also on a concern that one of the viewers had on the impacts of GMO as you finish up on that, because you are talking about the genetic modification process. And largely what your thoughts are with regards to the aggregation exercises that the government has embarked on in developing the capacities of the counties to value add the food that they produce. Can that be a strategy to address the problem we are facing?
Well, Ayub, and there is no serious scientist of genetic engineering who would say that it is a silver bullet. And again, this is a narrative that has always been put on our mouth, thinking that GMO is now the silver bullet. What we keep saying, GMOs address particular challenges. For instance, if you have a problem with the pests, and you feel that that is the major thing that is affecting you, we just come in and in another way help that crop become pest tolerant. And this is, how do we do it? We must make sure that there is something that pest is either is a repellent, or it maims it, or it makes it not able to survive. And what we know is that all those attributes are conducted or are taken care of by the DNA itself. So the luck that we have is that we are able to sequence this very unique sequence that is useful for protecting your maize against pest or protecting your maize against, say, striga, which is a weed. And therefore, the attempt by the government to make sure that we have even industrial parks or, science parks and these platforms where you can do value chain addition, value additions and all this, that is a welcome move. Okay. Because if we solve the problem with the pest, that is in the farm. And Abong and Jackie and Lucy will tell you that once you have harvested, that's not a problem of GMO. Even if it's a GMO seed that was tolerant to drought and pests, it has given you the yield, and you come and store it outside there where it's being rained on. Clearly you will have wastage. Clearly you'll have aflatoxin. So it is a holistic approach which speaks to all these intervening or interventions between the entire value chain, like I started, and we need to look at all of them. It is a comprehensive platform, and all of them are depending on each other. Okay. So for me, I would just say GMO is a tool, it's a technology, it has helped, and we need to use it where it is appropriate.
Okay, Lucy, your final comments?
Scalability. There's quite a lot of good practices that we are doing in this country. The only challenge is to what extent is it critical enough to make a difference. So requesting that we also look at what we've already done very well, and of course embracing technology, innovation, and the new ideas coming into the space of food security, but also looking at what has worked and making sure that we can scale it up to critical masses and, of course, impactful, rates that can, of course, make a difference in food security in this country. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Jacqueline Cohen.
My last comment would be that Kenya, just like most countries of the world, assented to the Malabo Declaration of, of investing 10% of their total budgets to food security. And this is a reminder to government, and I remember that the president of Kenya, mentioned this, and all the county governments, of course, that they should allocate 10% of this, to improve the capacity of farmers towards producing food. I know that is going to be imperative towards, food security. Okay, yes, Prof.
Yeah. I thought I would make a comment on aggregation.
Yes, please.
Because this is the heartbeat where I fall. Yeah. Now, aggregation, because I have quite an experience with it. I've worked with farmers. We have done aggregation with my colleagues. And we currently have what we are calling a hub at the university where I teach. And you have farmers that aggregate their produce, and then we have taken them through as well as value addition. And I've seen a tremendous change in the way they handle. And of course, when you talk about value addition, Ken, there is a lot of, you are not only in value adding the produce, but even the incomes increase. Now, the whole concept, as my colleagues say, is okay and good. It is a hardware that is been put in place, but the software can bring it down. It can become a white elephant as we speak with the time. And I've seen quite a number of that become white elephant aggregation centers because one is governance, right? So if you are not able to organize the farmers well, and you are not able to organize how the aggregation centers will run. And the other thing we are not very good at is maintenance, right? So who will ensure that this thing runs? It is actually based at the county. So who is going to run it? If it is the government at the county level, then you start beginning to think about many challenges, because where politics becomes the major player in that center, then you have issues of managing the same thing by looking at partisan management or partiality management. So I think that is where we need to ensure that these aggregation centers now run, looking at the governance and the funding model that it will. And then the last one is we need to ensure that whatever we aggregate has got a market. So without a market, even if you aggregate, even if you process, you still have not achieved what you wanted. So we have to work on those three.
And Prof, will our productivity allow us gain that height of prosperity which is required? Can we be at one point an export-oriented economy that can even export surplus food? Do we have that capacity?
Yes, we do, because we are privileged to have arable land that we can utilize. And as a country, we only need to work with the policy, adopt the right technologies, get the attitude right, and get to know which crop is actually the most viable for us. Not everything. We must target. There is no country in the world that exports everything.
Okay.
There must be that decision that this is our direction. Before, we used to export tea, coffee, and all that, but we also had groundnuts, and we never exported them. So it means we need to know our strength as a country and get to know how do we invest in it with the right policy, the aggregation as one of the platforms so that farmers get interested in this. But more importantly, and this is very important, we need to start talking to the youth and make them understand, because they are the future, to make them understand that agriculture is also trendy. It is also swaggy, and you can go out there and say, I'm a farmer. So we have actually done the same thing we did with the name GMO to farming. So farming is also very stereotyped. If you're a farmer, they don't see hopes, they don't see a future, and we are told to go to school, become, professors, and it looks good and all that. But at the end of it all, everybody must get something to eat. And as a country, or any development we are talking about, before we secure this country in terms of food security, we will always be suffering. And for me, it is possible that we only need to work on the value chain and ensure that we prioritize which areas and which crops are more viable, even for the export. So it is a possible dream. Okay, thank you. Your time is all appreciated. Professor Richard Oduor, the chairperson of the Kenya University Biotechnology Consortium and also a lecturer at the University of Kenyatta University. Your time is all appreciated. Lucy Sembe is the program manager, food security with the Kenya Red Cross. Thank you for your time. Professor George Abong is the chair, Department of Food Science at the University of Nairobi. Thank you. Your time is all appreciated. And Jacqueline Coyne is the Resilience Ambassador, Alliance for Science here in the country. Thank you. Your time is all appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to you too for watching the broadcast here on Daybreak. The hashtag has been Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. Thanks for watching.